In this gripping story about racism in America, Elijah Brooks, a successful black CEO, faces relentless opposition when he attempts to build a community center to uplift underserved residents. His efforts are sabotaged by a corrupt, racist councilman and a prejudiced police officer who conspire to destroy his reputation, using false accusations and abuse of power to derail his project. As Elijah endures public humiliation and systemic injustice, he must confront the deep-rooted racism that plagues his town and fight back against those determined to silence him. This emotional tale exposes the harsh realities of racism and corruption in modern society. Elijah Brooks stepped out of his sleek black Tesla, the sound of his polished leather shoes softly echoing against the cobblestones of the town square. The crisp autumn air carried the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart, mingling with the sharper tang of cold steel from the construction site across the street. This was his usual evening ritual, a brisk walk to the cafe on the corner, the one that served the perfect Americano. It was one of the few moments he allowed himself to slow down. At 46, Elijah was the kind of man who drew attention effortlessly. Tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and skin that gleamed like polished mahogany under the streetlights, he carried himself with a quiet confidence. Yet despite his imposing presence, there was a warmth to his demeanor, a disarming smile, a nod to passers-by, that reminded people he was one of them. He liked it that way. Elijah was the CEO of Brookstone Industries, a Fortune 500 company specializing in renewable energy. He had built his empire from the ground up, transforming an ambitious startup into a global powerhouse over 2 decades. His face graced the covers of business magazines, his name was invoked in boardrooms across the world, and his influence extended from Wall Street to Capitol Hill. But here, in his hometown of Ashwood, he was just Eli, a man who preferred modest suits to designer labels and still carried his own groceries. The cafe was bustling tonight. Warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk, illuminating the frost on the glass doors. Inside, locals huddled over steaming cups, their laughter and murmurs blending into a comforting hum. Elijah stepped in, brushing off the chill as the doorbell chimed softly behind him. "Evening, Mr. Brooks," called out Martha, the cafe's elderly owner. She was wiping down the counter, her silver hair tied back in a bun. "Evening, Martha," Elijah replied with a smile, slipping a 20 into the tip jar as he always did. "How's business?" "Steady as ever," she said, her eyes crinkling with gratitude. "The usual?" "You know me too well." As Martha prepared his Americano, Elijah found a seat by the window. He liked this spot. From here, he could see the courthouse across the square. A building steeped in history, with its white columns and ivy-covered walls. It was where his father had worked as a janitor for 30 years, sweeping floors and mopping marble corridors. Late into the night, Elijah often thought of him when he passed by. "You've done well, son," his father had said before he passed, pride shining in his weary eyes. "Don't ever forget where you came from." Elijah hadn't. That's why he was here, in Ashwood, rather than in some penthouse overlooking Manhattan. This town had shaped him, taught him the value of hard work and humility, and now, it was his turn to give back. Through Brookstone's foundation, he funded scholarships, community centers, and clean energy projects in underserved neighborhoods. He wanted to create opportunities for others like him, opportunities that weren't there when he was growing up. Martha brought over his coffee, breaking his train of thought. "Anything else tonight, Mr. Brooks?" "No, this is perfect. Thanks, Martha." He took a sip, savoring the rich, bold flavor. As he gazed out the window, his phone buzzed on the table. A message from his assistant, Camille. "Meeting with Councilman Hayes tomorrow confirmed he's pushing back on the new housing project, says it's too ambitious for Ashwood." Elijah's jaw tightened. Councilman Richard Hayes was one of the town's power players, a man who clung to outdated ideas about who belonged where and what progress should look like. Elijah had encountered men like him before, polished on the outside, but steeped in prejudice just beneath the surface. Hayes had opposed every one of Elijah's initiatives, often under the guise of preserving tradition. Elijah typed a curt reply. "Understood schedule. A call with the legal team tonight. I want to explore all options." He put the phone down, exhaling deeply. His gaze shifted to the courthouse again, where the statue of Ashwood's founder loomed under the soft glow of streetlights. It struck him as ironic that the town's symbol of justice stood in the shadow of systemic inequities that still shaped its power structures. The door to the cafe opened, letting in a gust of cold air, along with a trio of young men in hoodies. They laughed loudly, their presence drawing glances from some of the patrons. Elijah noticed the subtle shift in the room, the way conversations hushed, the way eyes lingered on the newcomers longer than necessary. He could feel the undercurrent of tension, a quiet judgment reserved for those who didn't fit the town's mold. Elijah had experienced it too, even now. He recalled an incident just last month when a clerk at a high-end boutique in the neighboring city had questioned whether he could afford the suit he'd picked out. It was subtle, wrapped in a saccharine smile, but the message had been clear. The young men ordered their drinks and settled at a corner table, oblivious to the stares. Elijah shook his head, his thoughts drifting back to the housing project. It wasn't just about buildings, it was about creating spaces where everyone, regardless of background, could feel they belonged. But men like Hayes saw inclusivity as a threat, not a promise. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Camille. "One more thing, Officer Grayson called, wants to meet tomorrow about the community center. Something about security concerns." Elijah frowned. Officer Grayson had been vocal about his opposition to the center from the start, citing vague concerns about increased activity in the area. To Elijah, it was just another way of saying he didn't want certain people, black and brown youth, gathering in the neighborhood. "Everything all right, Mr. Brooks?" Martha's voice pulled him back. She stood nearby, concern etched on her face. "Just work," Elijah said with a reassuring smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Martha nodded but didn't press further. She returned to the counter, leaving Elijah to his thoughts. As he finished his coffee and gathered his things, Elijah noticed a man at the far end of the cafe watching him intently. He was in his early 40s, wearing a sheriff's uniform, his badge catching the light. Their eyes met briefly, before the man looked away, pretending to read the menu. Elijah recognized him. Deputy Harrington, one of Grayson's allies. He had a reputation for being by the book, though whose book he followed was often up for debate. Elijah paid his bill and stepped out into the cold night. As he walked toward his car, he felt a faint unease. It wasn't new. He'd learned to live with it. But tonight, it was sharper. Like a whisper in the back of his mind, telling him something was about to change. The Tesla unlocked with a soft beep as he approached. Sliding into the driver's seat, Elijah sat for a moment, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He saw the man he'd become. The success, the responsibility, the expectations. But he also saw the boy who had swept floors with his father at the courthouse, dreaming of a day when he wouldn't have to prove his worth. Taking a deep breath, he started the car, the soft hum of the electric engine breaking the silence. As he drove home, the shadows of Ashwood stretched long and deep, and for the first time in years, they felt more like barriers than memories. The next morning, Elijah Brooks arrived at the town hall promptly at 9 a.m., his tailored charcoal gray suit and polished Oxford shoes a quiet assertion of his authority. The building was a relic of Ashwood's history, its sandstone facade and wrought iron gates exuding a charm that masked its outdated ideals. As Elijah stepped inside, the faint smell of varnish and paper filled the air, a reminder of the bureaucratic grind that defined the place. Councilman Richard Hayes was already waiting in the conference room. He sat at the head of the long oak table, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, a smug smile playing on his lips. Hayes wore his privilege like a second skin, his demeanor dripping with the confidence of a man who rarely faced opposition. He stood as Elijah entered, extending a hand that felt more like a formality than a gesture of respect. "Mr. Brooks," Hayes said, his voice warm but laced with condescension. "Glad you could make it." "Councilman Hayes," Elijah replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet. I'm eager to discuss the housing project." Hayes gestured for Elijah to sit, his smile tightening. "Of course, though I must admit, I still have my reservations. Projects like these often attract certain challenges." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He knew exactly what Hayes meant. The councilman's objections to the affordable housing initiative had been thinly veiled. Criticisms of the people it would serve. Working-class families, many of them black and brown Hayes, had cloaked his resistance in the language of zoning regulations and economic feasibility. But Elijah saw through the facade. Challenges are inevitable, Elijah said, his tone steady. But there are also opportunities. This project isn't just about housing, it's about creating a community that thrives. Ashwood can set an example for other towns. Hayes leaned back in his chair, feigning interest. An admirable vision. But as I've said before, there are concerns about how this might affect property values and the character of our town. The word character hung in the air, like a weapon. Elijah met Hayes's gaze, his calm exterior masking the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. I understand your concerns, Councilman, Elijah said, choosing his words carefully. But change doesn't diminish a community's character. It strengthens it. Diversity and inclusivity are assets, not liabilities. Hayes's smile faltered for a moment before returning, his eyes narrowing slightly. Well, we'll need to review the details further before making any commitments. You know how these things go, protocols, procedures, and all that. Elijah nodded, knowing this was Hayes's way of stalling. Of course, I'll ensure my team provides any additional information you need. As the meeting ended, Hayes extended his hand again, the grip weaker this time. We'll be in touch. Elijah left the room, the polished floors amplifying the sound of his footsteps. He couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes was playing a long game, one that didn't include supporting the project. It wasn't just resistance, it was sabotage. Later that afternoon, Elijah arrived at the Ashwood Police Precinct to meet with Officer Grayson about the community center. The building was less welcoming than Town Hall, its gray brick exterior and chain-link fencing stark against the vibrant autumn leaves inside. The fluorescent lighting and scuffed linoleum floors gave it an air of utilitarian indifference. Grayson was waiting in the lobby, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He was a stocky man in his early 50s, with a buzz cut and the kind of demeanor that demanded deference. Mr. Brooks, Grayson said, his tone clipped. Follow me. Elijah offered a polite nod and followed him down a narrow hallway, lined with bulletin boards and faded posters. Grayson led him to a small conference room, where a file folder sat on the table. Have a seat, Grayson said, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. Elijah sat, his posture relaxed but attentive. Thank you for meeting with me, Officer Grayson. I understand you have concerns about the community center. Grayson opened the folder, his fingers lingering on the edges of the papers. Yes, we've had reports of increased activity in the area, loitering, disturbances, that sort of thing. It's our job to ensure the safety of all residents. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Increased activity. The center hasn't even opened yet. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. We're anticipating issues based on similar projects in other towns. These centers tend to attract a certain element. There it was. The thinly veiled prejudice. Elijah felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but he kept his tone measured. Officer Grayson, the purpose of this center is to provide resources and support for the community. It's designed to uplift, not disrupt. Grayson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. I'm sure your intentions are good, Mr. Brooks, but good intentions don't always translate into good outcomes. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. I've seen the outcomes, officer. I've seen young people find mentorship, families gain access to critical resources, and communities grow stronger. That's what this center represents. Grayson's eyes narrowed. Be that as it may, we'll need to monitor the situation closely. If we see any signs of trouble, there will be consequences. The implicit threat hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Elijah clenched his fists under the table, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to push back, to call out the blatant bias, but he knew this wasn't the time or place. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly. I appreciate your diligence, Officer Grayson, Elijah said, his voice steady. But I trust you'll approach this with fairness and objectivity. Grayson's expression didn't change. We always do. The meeting ended on a tense note, and as Elijah walked out of the precinct, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. The resistance he faced wasn't new, but it was relentless, chipping away at his resolve, one interaction at a time. That evening, Elijah stopped by the community center to check on the progress. The building was nearly complete, its modern design standing out against the older structures surrounding it. Inside, workers were putting the finishing touches on the classrooms and recreational areas. "Mr. Brooks," called out Lisa, the project manager. She was a petite woman with boundless energy and a clipboard perpetually in hand. "You're just in time, we're about to test the lighting in the main hall." "Let's see it," Elijah said, his tone lighter than he felt. As Lisa led him through the building, Elijah's phone buzzed with a message. Officer Grayson stopped by earlier. Asked a lot of questions about security and who would be using the center. Seemed suspicious. Elijah frowned, his earlier conversation with Grayson replaying in his mind. The officer wasn't just skeptical, he was looking for reasons to undermine the project. "Everything okay?" Lisa asked, noticing his expression. "Just the usual hurdles," Elijah replied, tucking his phone away. "Nothing we can't handle." As he stood in the main hall, watching the lights flicker on one by one, Elijah felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about a building, it was about standing firm against a system that sought to exclude and marginalize. He wouldn't let the likes of Hayes or Grayson dictate the future of Ashwood. But as he looked around the empty hall, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was just beginning. Elijah Brooks stood at the podium in the community center's main hall, addressing a gathering of local leaders, activists, and residents. It was the grand unveiling, a chance to celebrate the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. The polished floors gleamed under the overhead lights, and the faint scent of fresh paint lingered in the air. Rows of chairs were filled with eager faces, young and old, black and white, hopeful and skeptical. "This center represents more than bricks and mortar," Elijah said, his rich baritone filling the space. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we invest in our community. It's a place where every child, every family, and every dream is welcome." The crowd broke into applause, but Elijah's gaze lingered on the back of the room, where Officer Grayson stood with Deputy Harrington. Their presence was uninvited, but not unexpected. Grayson's arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, while Harrington whispered something to him, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Elijah kept his composure, finishing his speech with a call to action. "Let this be the start of something bigger. Together, we can build a brighter future for Ashwood." The applause grew louder as Elijah stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with attendees. But the air felt charged, as if something simmered just beneath the surface. His assistant, Camille, approached with a worried look. "Grayson's been asking the staff questions all evening," she said under her breath. "He's looking for something, Elijah." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. Let him look, he won't find anything. But deep down, he knew that men like Grayson didn't need to find anything. They created trouble when it suited them. The trouble started as the event wound down. Elijah was speaking with Lisa near the front entrance when Grayson and Harrington approached, their boots heavy on the polished floor. "Mr. Brooks," Grayson said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the remaining guests. "We need to have a word." Elijah turned to face them, his calm demeanor a shield against the tension that crackled in the air. "Of course, Officer Grayson. What can I do for you?" Grayson held up a sheet of paper, his expression grave. "We received a report about irregularities with the permits for this center. It seems there's been a mistake." Elijah's stomach dropped, but he didn't flinch. "A mistake that's unlikely. All permits were filed and approved months ago. If there's an issue, my legal team will address it." Harrington stepped closer, a smug grin on his face. "That won't be necessary. We're here to shut this place down until the matter is resolved." The room went silent. Guests, who had been mingling near the door, stopped in their tracks, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. Lisa stepped forward, her voice trembling with indignation. "This is absurd. We've followed every regulation." Grayson cut her off. "Ma'am, this is a legal matter. We're simply following procedure." Elijah raised a hand, signaling Lisa to step back. "Officer Grayson, you're making a scene without cause. If there's truly an issue, it can be handled through the proper channels. But shutting down this center tonight is unnecessary and unjust." Grayson's eyes narrowed. I suggest you cooperate, Mr. Brooks. Refusing to comply could lead to further consequences. The implied threat hung in the air. Elijah felt the weight of every eye in the room on him, the unspoken question. Would he fight back or stand down? Elijah took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. I will comply because I respect the law, even when it's being misused, but understand this. Your actions tonight won't go unnoticed. I'll see to it that this center opens, no matter how many roadblocks you throw in its way. Grayson's lips curled into a faint sneer. We'll see about that. As the officers began posting, closed by order of the Ashwood Police Department, signs on the doors, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Camille. Mitchell wants to meet, she said. He says it's urgent. Elijah glanced at Grayson and Harrington, who were watching him from the corner of the room, like vultures circling their prey. Tell him I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mitchell Rhodes was a hesitant ally, a junior councilman whose career straddled the line between ambition and conscience. Elijah found him at a diner on the edge of town, nervously stirring a cup of coffee. You're not making any friends in the council, Elijah, Mitchell said, as Elijah slid into the booth across from him. Hayes is livid. He's been pushing for ways to shut you down, and Grayson's more than happy to help. Elijah leaned back, his expression unreadable. And you? Where do you stand, Mitchell? Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. I don't agree with them, but Hayes, he's got connections. He's untouchable. No one's untouchable, Elijah said, his voice low but resolute. What do you know about this so-called permit issue? Mitchell glanced around, lowering his voice. It's bogus, the permits are clean, but Hayes is leveraging an old zoning clause to claim the center doesn't meet historical district standards. It's a stretch, but technically, he can tie it up in red tape for months. Elijah's fists clenched under the table. And Grayson? Hayes uses him as a bulldog. He gets to play the enforcer while Hayes keeps his hands clean. Mitchell sighed. Look, I'm telling you this because I believe in what you're doing, but if you push too hard, they'll come at you with everything they've got. Elijah nodded, his mind already racing. Thanks for the warning, Mitchell, but I didn't build what I have by backing down. They want a fight. I'll give them one. The next day, Elijah's determination was put to the test. As he walked into his office at Brookstone Industries, Camille was waiting with a stack of papers and a grave expression. It's worse than we thought, she said, handing him the top document. Hayes has filed an injunction to stop the center's opening indefinitely, and Grayson's launched an investigation into alleged financial irregularities. Elijah scanned the document, his jaw tightening. They're grasping at straws. But they're creating enough noise to make people doubt, Camille said. The press is already sniffing around. Elijah leaned against his desk, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Then we'll make noise of our own, call the legal team, and set up a press conference for tomorrow. If they want a public battle, we'll give them one. Camille nodded, her eyes glinting with determination. I'll get it done. That evening, Elijah returned to the community center, now dark and locked under the weight of Grayson's order. He stood in the parking lot, staring at the building that symbolized so much more than a project. It was a promise, a beacon for a better future. As he turned to leave, the rumble of an engine caught his attention. A police cruiser pulled into the lot, its headlights illuminating him like a spotlight. Grayson stepped out, his hand resting casually on his holster. Still hanging around, Mr. Brooks, he said, his tone mocking. You must really love this place. Elijah squared his shoulders, his calm mask firmly in place. I do, Officer Grayson, and so will this town, once it opens. Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. You're a stubborn man, I'll give you that, but you're out of your depth. People like you don't change how things work around here. Elijah took a step closer, his voice calm but laced with steel. People like me have been changing the world for generations. You can delay progress, officer, but you can't stop it. Grayson's smile faded, replaced by a hard glare. We'll see about that. As the cruiser drove off, Elijah stood alone in the lot, the words echoing in his mind. We'll see about that. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. His resolve hardened as he walked back to his car, the darkness around him a stark contrast to the light he was determined to bring to Ashwood. The next morning, Elijah Brooks strode into the town square, his polished demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath reporters and camera crews clustered around the steps of the courthouse, their lenses trained on the center of the commotion, a podium bearing the seal of Ashwood. Elijah adjusted his tie, his sharp gray suit catching the sunlight as he prepared to make his statement. The press conference was his move, a calculated step to take control of the narrative. He couldn't allow Hayes and Grayson to paint him as a villain or a fraud. He had spent too long building his reputation, and he wouldn't let it crumble under their baseless accusations. Camille stood beside him, holding a folder of documents that would debunk every claim Hayes and Grayson had made. Mitchell lingered on the fringes, his nervous gaze darting between the crowd and the courthouse doors. Elijah wasn't sure if Mitchell was there as an ally or a bystander, but he hoped the junior councilman's presence would at least signal to the public that not everyone in local government opposed him. "Mr. Brooks," a reporter called out as Elijah approached the podium, "can you confirm the allegations of financial misconduct tied to the community center project?" Elijah faced the crowd, his expression calm and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'll address all questions shortly. But first, let me make one thing clear. The community center is not just a project. It's a lifeline for Ashwood. The allegations against me and my team are baseless and intended to distract from the real issue, creating opportunities for underserved communities." As he spoke, he felt a surge of determination. The crowd's energy was palpable, a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and support. This was his chance to set the record straight. Before he could continue, the courthouse doors burst open and Councilman Hayes stepped out, flanked by Officer Grayson and Deputy Harrington. The three of them descended the steps like a triumphant procession, their presence an unspoken challenge to Elijah's authority. "Elijah Brooks," Hayes said, his voice booming through the square. "Your disregard for protocol and the law cannot be ignored. This town demands accountability." Elijah's jaw tightened. He stepped aside from the podium as Hayes approached, the councilman's smug smile grating against his nerves. "I have nothing to hide, Councilman," Elijah said evenly. "In fact, I welcome a transparent review of all permits and finances tied to the community center." Hayes chuckled, shaking his head. "Your confidence is admirable, but misplaced, Officer Grayson. Would you do the honors?" Grayson stepped forward, holding a document aloft. "Mr. Brooks, by order of the Ashwood Police Department, we are placing you under investigation for financial fraud and zoning violations." The square erupted in gasps and murmurs. Elijah's heart pounded as Grayson held out a pair of handcuffs, the metal glinting in the sunlight. He could feel the weight of every camera lens trained on him, the moment playing out like a public spectacle orchestrated for maximum humiliation. "You can't be serious," Camille said, stepping forward. "This is a blatant abuse of power." Grayson ignored her, his cold gaze fixed on Elijah. "Mr. Brooks, please place your hands behind your back." Elijah's composure didn't falter. He stood tall, his voice calm but firm. "This is nothing more than a political stunt. You have no evidence, no basis for these accusations." Grayson's lips curled into a smirk. "That's for the courts to decide." Reluctantly, Elijah extended his hands, the weight of the cuffs a sharp contrast to the freedom he had spent his life fighting for. The reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony as Grayson led Elijah toward a waiting police cruiser. Mitchell took a hesitant step forward. "This isn't right," he muttered, but his voice was lost in the commotion. The ride to the precinct was suffocating. Elijah sat in the back of the cruiser, his mind racing. He knew Hayes and Grayson had overplayed their hand, but the damage had already been done. The image of him being led away in cuffs would dominate the news cycle, fueling doubts and fears among those who supported him. When they arrived, Grayson escorted him into a dimly lit interrogation room. The walls were bare, the air heavy with the stale scent of sweat and cleaning products. Grayson dropped a thick file onto the table, his movements deliberate. "Take a seat," he said, gesturing to the metal chair. Elijah complied, his expression calm, but his anger simmering beneath the surface. Grayson leaned against the table, his eyes narrowing as he flipped open the file. "You've built quite the empire, haven't you, Mr. Brooks?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Brookstone Industries, the community center, all those fancy initiatives, but it only takes one crack to bring the whole thing down." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "If you have questions, Officer Grayson, I suggest you ask them. Otherwise, I'll be calling my attorney." Grayson's smirk faltered for a moment before he straightened, pulling out a series of documents. "These zoning violations aren't going away, and neither are the discrepancies in your financial records." Elijah's patience wore thin. "You and I both know those discrepancies don't exist. This is a coordinated attack by people who fear change. People like you." Grayson's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the door opened, and Mitchell stepped inside. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he held up his phone. "You need to stop this," Mitchell said, his voice unsteady. "There's a video." Grayson frowned. "What are you talking about?" Mitchell placed the phone on the table and hit play. The screen showed a grainy recording of Hayes and Grayson in what appeared to be the councilman's office. Their voices were clear, their conversation damning. "This center is a threat," Hayes was saying. "If we let Brooks succeed, he'll gain too much influence." Grayson's voice followed. "Don't worry, we'll tie him up in enough red tape to bury him." Elijah's heart raced as the recording continued, exposing their scheme in excruciating detail. When it ended, Mitchell's eyes met Elijah's. "I knew it was wrong," Mitchell said, his voice shaking. "I couldn't let them get away with it." Grayson's face turned crimson. "This doesn't prove anything." "It proves everything," Elijah said, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You've weaponized the law to protect your own power, and now the truth is out." Grayson opened his mouth to retort, but the door burst open again, this time revealing Camille and a reporter holding a microphone. The reporter's camera crew followed close behind, capturing every detail of the scene. "This is over, Grayson," Camille said, her voice sharp, "and the whole town will know it." The room buzzed with tension as the recording played on a loop, the reporter firing off questions while Camille stood by Elijah's side. Grayson looked cornered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the evidence. But Elijah wasn't done. He turned to the reporter, his voice steady and commanding. "This isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows people like Hayes and Grayson to thrive. It's about every community that's been silenced and every opportunity that's been stolen, and it ends now." The reporter nodded, the camera zooming in as Elijah's words filled the room. "Ashwood deserves better. Our future isn't theirs to dictate. It's ours to build." The crowd outside the precinct grew as news of the video spread, turning the tide in Elijah's favor. But as the weight of the moment settled, he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The air was thick with tension in the town square, as Elijah Brooks stood in the center of an ever-growing crowd. The video exposing Councilman Hayes and Officer Grayson had gone viral, igniting a firestorm of anger and support across Ashwood. Reporters jostled for position, microphones and cameras trained on Elijah, while residents, both supporters and skeptics, gathered to witness the confrontation. The courthouse steps, once a symbol of justice, now served as a stage for corruption laid bare. Councilman Hayes stood at the top of the steps, his face flushed with anger as he barked into his phone. Beside him, Officer Grayson's rigid posture betrayed the fury simmering beneath his calm facade. They had underestimated Elijah, but now the tables had turned. Elijah stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence silencing the murmurs in the crowd. "Councilman Hayes," he called out, his voice resonating across the square, "you owe this town an explanation. Your actions aren't just an attack on me, they're an attack on every resident of Ashwood who dares to hope for a better future." Hayes turned, his face a mask of forced composure. "This is a misunderstanding," he began, his voice clipped. "You're exploiting a private conversation taken out of context." "Out of context?" Elijah interrupted, his voice rising with controlled indignation. "You conspired to weaponize the law against me because you fear change, you fear progress, and you fear losing control over a town that doesn't belong to you." The crowd erupted in murmurs, a tide of anger and disbelief washing over them. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but Elijah wasn't finished. "You didn't just attack me," Elijah continued, stepping closer to the steps. "You attacked the youth who would have found mentorship at the community center. You attacked the families who would have gained access to vital resources, and you did it because you couldn't stand the idea of someone like me making a difference." Grayson stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster, in a subtle but menacing gesture. "That's enough, Brooks," he said, his voice low and dangerous. You've had your say, now it's time to let the law handle this. Elijah turned to him, unflinching. The law? You mean the same law you've twisted to serve your own agenda? You're not protecting this town, you're protecting your power. The crowd surged closer, their voices growing louder in support of Elijah. Grayson's fingers twitched near his holster, his authority slipping as the crowd's anger grew. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Grayson said, stepping down a few steps to close the distance between them. You think your money, your influence, makes you immune. But let me tell you something, Brooks. People like you always overreach. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. People like me. You mean black men, who dare to succeed, black men, who dare to stand up to people like you. Grayson's face darkened, his composure cracking. Watch yourself, Brooks, he growled, his voice dripping with menace. Before Elijah could respond, Camille emerged from the crowd, holding a microphone connected to one of the news cameras. Officer Grayson, she said, her voice sharp and clear. The whole town just saw the video of you conspiring with Councilman Hayes. Are you denying its authenticity? Grayson faltered, his gaze darting between Camille and the cameras. This isn't the time or place, he muttered, his usual confidence slipping. It's exactly the time and place, Elijah said, his voice steady. The people of Ashwood deserve answers, and they deserve leaders who serve them, not themselves. The crowd roared in agreement, their anger now fully directed at Hayes and Grayson. Hayes stepped forward, his face a mask of desperation. Enough of this circus, he shouted. Mr. Brooks, you've caused enough trouble in this town, it's time for you to… To what? Elijah interrupted, his voice rising. To leave, to stop fighting for the people you've ignored and exploited. That's not going to happen. Hayes, this is my town too, and it's time you and Grayson answered for what you've done. The confrontation reached its boiling point as the crowd surged closer, their chants of "Justice for Ashwood" echoing through the square. Grayson reached for his radio, barking orders to officers nearby to disperse the crowd, but the tension was too high to contain. At that moment, Mitchell stepped forward, his face pale but determined. He climbed the steps to stand beside Elijah, turning to face the crowd. I've been silent for too long, he said, his voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. What Mr. Brooks says is true. Councilman Hayes and Officer Grayson have abused their power, and I won't stand by any longer. Hayes rounded on Mitchell, his voice a venomous hiss. You're making a mistake, Mitchell. A mistake you won't recover from. Mitchell squared his shoulders, his voice unwavering. The only mistake would be staying silent. The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy electrifying the square. Grayson and Hayes exchanged panicked glances, their control slipping with every passing second. Elijah seized the moment, his voice cutting through the noise. This isn't the end, it's the beginning. Together, we'll take back this town and build a future where everyone has a voice, and it starts today. As the crowd chanted his name, Elijah turned to Hayes and Grayson, his expression calm but unyielding. Your time is up. Hayes turned and stormed back into the courthouse, his face flushed with humiliation. Grayson hesitated, his hand still on his holster, before retreating with a glare that promised retribution. But Elijah wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his resolve. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Elijah Brooks stepped out of the Ashwood police precinct, his hands trembling but his mind sharp. The crowd outside was larger than he'd anticipated. Protesters held signs demanding justice. Reporters thrust microphones into the faces of passers-by, and residents argued among themselves. At the center of the chaos stood Officer Grayson, flanked by two deputies, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. Councilman Hayes was nearby, speaking animatedly to a small cluster of supporters. The tension in the air was thick, every word spoken adding fuel to the growing fire. Elijah! Camille's voice cut through the noise. She pushed her way through the crowd, phone in hand. We've got everything, the footage, the documents, everything we need to prove the permits were legitimate and that Hayes and Grayson coordinated this sham. Elijah nodded, his mind racing. Send it to every news outlet, post it online, make sure everyone sees it. Camille hesitated, her eyes darting to Grayson and Hayes. Are you sure this could escalate things? Elijah's gaze hardened as he stared at Grayson. It already has. As Elijah made his way toward the courthouse steps, the crowd parted for him, their murmurs growing louder. Hayes noticed his approach and straightened, his polished smile quickly replaced by a scowl. Grayson's hand hovered near his holster, the tension in his posture unmistakable. "Mr. Brooks," Hayes said, his voice dripping with forced civility. "What are you doing here? I'd think you'd want to keep a low profile after all the controversy surrounding your little project." Elijah stopped at the bottom of the steps, his broad shoulders and towering frame commanding attention. "I'm here to expose the truth, Councilman, to show this town exactly who you are." Hayes's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "And what truth is that? That you've been operating under false pretenses, that your so-called community center is nothing more than a vanity project?" The crowd gasped at the accusation, but Elijah remained calm. "The truth is, you and Officer Grayson have conspired to block this project at every turn. You've used fear, lies and abuse of power to maintain control over this town. But it ends today." Grayson stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "Watch yourself, Brooks. You're treading on dangerous ground." Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "Dangerous for whom, officer? For you, for Hayes, or for the system that's crumbling under the weight of its own corruption?" The tension exploded as Elijah pulled out his phone, holding it high. "This is the recording of Hayes and Grayson plotting to frame me. This is the proof of their collusion, their lies, their fear of change, and now, the whole world will see it." The crowd erupted, their voices a chaotic blend of anger and support. Hayes lunged forward, his composure cracking. "You think this will ruin me? You think anyone will believe you over me?" "Yes, they will," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Because they've seen it before, they've lived it, and now, they're ready to fight back." Grayson's face darkened, and his hand moved to his gun. But before he could act, Camille stepped forward, her phone recording the scene. "Make one wrong move, officer, and this will be live-streamed to millions." Grayson froze, his jaw clenched, his fury barely contained. "You think you're smart, don't you? Always playing the victim, always making everything about race." Elijah's voice rose, cutting through the noise. "It's not about playing the victim, Grayson. It's about standing up to people like you. People who weaponize their power to suppress others, who refuse to accept that the world is changing." The crowd surged closer, their anger palpable. Grayson glanced at Hayes, who was now visibly sweating. "Do something!" Hayes hissed, his voice frantic, but before Grayson could respond, Mitchell Rhodes stepped forward, his voice shaky but determined. "They're right," he said, addressing the crowd. "Everything Elijah has said is true. I've seen the documents, the recordings. Hayes and Grayson have been manipulating this town for years, and I'm done being complicit." Hayes turned on him, his voice a venomous hiss. "You're making a mistake, Mitchell." "No," Mitchell said, his voice growing stronger. "The mistake was staying silent." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy electrifying the square. Hayes and Grayson exchanged panicked glances, their control slipping with every passing second. The turning point came when Elijah stepped forward, his voice ringing out over the chaos. "This isn't just about me or the community center, it's about Ashwood's future. Are we going to let fear and corruption dictate our lives, or are we going to stand together and demand better?" The crowd responded with a resounding roar, their chants of "Justice for Ashwood" echoing through the square. Grayson and Hayes retreated to the courthouse steps, their authority crumbling under the weight of public outcry. Elijah turned to the reporters, his voice calm but resolute. "This is what change looks like. It's messy, it's painful, but it's necessary, and it starts here, today." The section ends with uncertainty, as Hayes and Grayson disappear into the courthouse, leaving the crowd energized but unsure of what comes next. Elijah stands tall amidst the chaos, ready to face whatever challenges lie ahead, his resolve stronger than ever. The courthouse was eerily quiet as Elijah Brooks watched Hayes and Grayson retreat into its shadows. The crowd behind him was still energized, their chants echoing through the square like a war cry. But Elijah knew this was only the beginning of a larger battle. The public had seen the truth, but holding those responsible to account would require more than a single act of defiance. Camille appeared at his side, her expression a mixture of relief and determination. "The video's already trending," she said. News outlets are picking it up. Hayes and Grayson won't be able to hide from this. Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the courthouse steps. Good, but we need to do more. Public opinion won't be enough to dismantle what they've built. Inside the courthouse, Hayes and Grayson faced the fallout of their exposed corruption. Calls flooded into their offices, reporters demanded interviews, and their once loyal allies began to distance themselves. Mitchell Rhodes, emboldened by his public confession, stepped forward with a trove of documents detailing Hayes's manipulation of town resources and Grayson's history of racial profiling. The revelations were damning. Over the next few days, the state attorney general's office launched a formal investigation, suspending Hayes from the council and placing Grayson on administrative leave. The community center project, once stalled, was cleared to proceed, with an apology from the zoning commission for the unwarranted delays. For Elijah, the victory was bittersweet. He stood in the main hall of the community center a week later, watching as workers resumed construction. The scaffolding, the smell of fresh paint, and the buzz of drills felt like symbols of hope. But Elijah knew the fight for justice wasn't over. Camille entered, holding a stack of documents. The state investigators want your statement about Hayes and Grayson. They're building a case for criminal charges. Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll give them everything they need. But this isn't just about Hayes and Grayson, it's about the system that allowed them to operate unchecked for so long. Camille placed a hand on his shoulder. You've already made a huge impact, Elijah. The town is waking up because of you. Elijah smiled faintly. Let's make sure they stay awake. The effects of Elijah's stand rippled across Ashwood Town Hall meetings, saw record attendance as residents demanded accountability from their leaders. Activists organized workshops and events to educate the community about systemic racism and corruption. The town's youth, inspired by Elijah's resilience, began volunteering at the community center even before its official opening. Mitchell Rhodes, once a hesitant ally, became a vocal advocate for reform. He publicly apologized for his complicity and pledged to work with Elijah to push for systemic changes in town governance. Together, they proposed a set of new policies aimed at increasing transparency, improving police accountability, and investing in underserved neighborhoods. For Elijah, the ordeal had been transformative. Standing on the other side of his battle with Hayes and Grayson, he felt a deeper sense of purpose. The experience had reinforced his belief in the power of collective action and the importance of perseverance in the face of injustice. One evening, as the sun set over Ashwood, Elijah sat in the nearly completed community center. The warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the large windows, casting golden light across the polished floors. Camille joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Quiet night? She asked, handing him a cup. Elijah nodded, taking a sip. For now. But I know there's more work ahead. Camille smiled. And I know you're ready for it. Elijah gazed out the window, his mind already racing with plans for the future. He thought about the next steps, expanding the center's programs, holding town leaders accountable, and mentoring the next generation of advocates. He wasn't naive enough to believe the fight was over, but he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The community center's grand opening was a moment of triumph. Hundreds of residents gathered to celebrate, their cheers echoing through the halls as Elijah cut the ceremonial ribbon. Children ran through the halls, their laughter a reminder of why the center mattered. Families toured the classrooms, gymnasium, and resource rooms, marveling at the opportunities the center promised. As Elijah stood on the stage addressing the crowd, he felt a surge of pride and gratitude. This center is not mine, he said. It belongs to all of you. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we stand together and refuse to back down. This is just the beginning. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy infectious. Elijah glanced at Camille, who stood in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Mitchell was beside her, nodding in agreement. The sight of them, along with the diverse crowd of supporters, filled Elijah with hope. As the event wound down, Elijah found a quiet moment to reflect. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the sun dip below the horizon. A young boy approached him, holding a small notebook. Mr. Brooks, the boy said shyly, will you sign this? I want to be like you when I grow up. Elijah crouched to meet the boy's eyes, his smile warm. What do you want to do when you grow up? I want to help people, the boy said simply. Elijah nodded, signing the notebook with a flourish. "Then you're already on the right path." As the boy ran off to join his friends, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but moments like these reminded him why it was worth it. The story concludes with Elijah walking back into the community center, ready to continue his work. The community's struggle for justice and equality had just begun, but Elijah's resilience and leadership had sparked a movement that promised a brighter future for Ashwood. The quiet hum of the community center enveloped Elijah Brooks as he stood in its main hall, now bustling with activity. Children laughed as they raced down the polished corridors, their voices a joyful contrast to the quiet resolve that had driven Elijah through the most challenging months of his life. Parents gathered in classrooms for workshops, and volunteers staffed resource tables, their dedication a testament to the center's mission. Elijah watched the scene with a sense of fulfillment, his hands resting in his pockets. The journey to this moment had been grueling, marked by betrayal, public humiliation, and a battle against entrenched power. Yet standing here now, he felt more connected to his purpose than ever before. The struggle had reshaped him, forcing him to confront not just the systems he fought against, but also the limits of his own endurance and belief in justice. For Elijah, the confrontation with Hayes and Grayson had been a moment of reckoning, not just with them, but with himself. He had entered the battle as a man who believed in the power of the law and the institutions he'd spent his life serving. But he emerged with a deeper understanding of the flaws within those systems and the resilience required to challenge them. He had learned to harness his anger without letting it consume him. The humiliation of being handcuffed and paraded in front of the town was a scar he would carry, but it also became a symbol of his determination. He had faced his detractors not with rage, but with unwavering resolve, using their attempts to discredit him as fuel to expose their corruption. In doing so, he discovered a well of strength he hadn't realized he possessed. The experience had also taught him the power of collective action. He'd seen how allies like Camille and Mitchell had risen to the occasion, how the people of Ashwood had rallied behind him when the truth came to light. This wasn't a fight he had won alone. It was a victory forged through unity and shared purpose. The events that had unfolded in Ashwood were a microcosm of a much larger battle. Hayes and Grayson were not anomalies. They were products of a system that rewarded those who wielded power without accountability. Their actions, conspiring to block progress, manipulating laws, and weaponizing racial prejudice, were symptoms of systemic racism and abuse of authority that extended far beyond the borders of the town. But the exposure of their corruption had sent shockwaves through the community. It sparked conversations that had long been silenced, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they lived within. The state attorney general's investigation into Hayes and Grayson not only led to their removal from power, but also prompted a broader review of Ashwood's governance and law enforcement practices. This wasn't just about holding two individuals accountable. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed them to thrive. Elijah's fight had become a catalyst for change, inspiring neighboring towns to examine their own practices and empowering grassroots movements to demand transparency and equity. The community center had always been more than a building. It was a symbol of possibility, a space where people could come together to learn, grow, and support one another. For Elijah, it represented a tangible step toward the future he envisioned, one where opportunities weren't dictated by zip codes or skin color. Programs at the center quickly gained momentum. After-school tutoring, career training workshops, and mental health counseling became cornerstones of its mission. The center also hosted town hall meetings, providing a platform for residents to voice their concerns and hold leaders accountable. One of the most meaningful initiatives was the mentorship program, which paired local youth with professionals in various fields. Elijah personally mentored several young men and women, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to pursue their dreams despite the obstacles they might face. For him, this was the most rewarding part of the journey, knowing that his fight had opened doors for the next generation. As Elijah reflected on the events that had brought him to this moment, he felt a profound sense of hope. The battle against Hayes and Grayson had been a painful reminder of how far society still had to go, but it also demonstrated the power of resilience and collective action. His story wasn't just about standing up to injustice, it was about the ripple effect of courage. His determination had inspired others to act, to question, and to demand better. Camille's unwavering support, Mitchell's decision to break his silence, and the community's decision to rally together were all testaments to the strength that emerged when people united around a common goal. Elijah understood that progress would be slow and that setbacks were inevitable, but he also believed that each step forward, no matter how small, was a victory worth celebrating. His fight had sparked a movement, and he was determined to keep it alive, not just in Ashwood, but beyond. As the evening settled over the community center, Elijah found himself on the rooftop, looking out over the town he had fought so hard to change. The lights from the center glowed warmly below, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Camille joined him, a contented smile on her face. "You did it," she said, leaning against the railing. "We did it," Elijah corrected, his voice tinged with gratitude. "But there's still more to do." Camille nodded, her gaze following his. "Where do we start?" Elijah's lips curved into a determined smile. "Right here. We keep building, we keep fighting, and we make sure this isn't just a moment, it's a movement." Camille raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "Think Ashwood's ready for all that?" Elijah turned to her, his voice steady. "Whether they're ready or not, it's happening." As they stood together, the wind carrying the faint sounds of laughter and conversation from the center below, Elijah felt a deep sense of purpose. His journey had been one of pain and struggle, but it had also been one of growth, resilience, and triumph. And while the road ahead would be long, he was ready to walk it, with his community beside him. Elijah Brooks' story was one of courage in the face of injustice, of hope born from adversity, and of the power of unity to challenge systems that seemed unchangeable. His journey reminded everyone watching that progress was possible. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Ashwood's transformation was far from complete, but it stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people refused to accept the status quo. Elijah's fight had ignited a spark, and it was up to those who followed to keep the flame alive. Let me know if there are any adjustments or additions you'd like before finalizing the story.